أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم قل هو الله أحد الله الصمد لم يلد ولم يولد ولم يكن له كفوا أحد. Say He is Allah who is one, Allah the eternal refuge. He neither begets nor is born, nor is there any harm, any equivalent to Him. Sadaqallahu lazim. رب اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقهوا قولي. الحمد لله. الصلاة والسلام على رسول النبي الكريم وعلى آله أصحابه أجمعين. أما بعد. Assalamu alaikum everyone for joining us today. Taif Digital Institute for Islamic Finance welcomes you all. Those who are joining in will be starting in about 5 minutes from now. Let me give you a brief introduction to Taif. Taif Digital Institute is created to lead the way through a new age approach to the training and awareness of Islamic finance. Taif is providing an end-to-end digital learning solution to Islamic banks and Islamic finance institutions by combining the knowledge of Islamic finance and technology and presenting it to the masses of the Ummah. Taif offers to make Islamic banking and finance to the world as a commercially viable solution by digitizing it and making it available to all. Today's webinar, the topic of today's webinar is Islamic alternative to LIBOR. And I have my honorable speaker today with me, Dr. Anwar Hasan Abdullah Othman is currently an assistant professor at IIUM, Institute of Islamic Banking and Finance, and working as Deputy Dean for Responsible Research and Innovation. He has Doctor of Philosophy in Business Administration Finance. He is working as editor for Journal of Islamic Finance, editor of Turkish Journal of Islamic Economics, and associate editor for International Journal of Al-Torah in Islamic Wealth and Finance. He has served for finance industry in Yemen, working with various organizations. He has participated in many local and global conferences. In addition, Dr. Anwar is currently supervising many PhD candidates in IIUM Institute of Islamic Banking and Finance. I must say his continuous effort and honesty with his profession has led him to where he is now. So before further ado, I would request my honorable speaker to come and share his work with you. Dr. Anwar Hasan Abdullah Othman, the mic is yours.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله تعالى وبركاته. رب اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقهوا قولي. First of all, I would like to thank Taif Digital Institute for Islamic Finance for organizing this important event. And today, inshallah, we are going to discuss the Islamic alternative benchmark to the LIBOR. So the outline of this presentation, including what is the problem with the current LIBOR, and also discuss the benchmark reform timeline, how are risk-free rate different from LIBOR, then the impact also of the LIBOR reform on Islamic financial industry, then propose for an Islamic benchmark to replace the LIBOR. Then comparing between LIBOR risk-free rate as well as the Islamic rate of return. So many financial institutions understood that using the LIBOR index in evaluation or in evaluating assets and contracts in financial markets will not achieve financial stability, as the introduction of LIBOR interest rate has triggered many financial crises, and this was due to the manipulation of LIBOR price, particularly during the 2007-2009, as well as the 2012 price determination scandal. Initially, the British Bankers Association was commissioned commissioned to publish the LIBOR term rate for a set of currencies, but as an ethical activities influence its completion process, and the 2012 wealthy recommendations recommend a reform, and LIBOR is now collected and circulated by international exchange in a five currency and seven maturities under the watchful eye of UK Financial Conduct Authority. However, the damage to LIBOR reputation was never fully restored, which led the FCA to announce the retirement of the LIBOR by the end of 2020. And this also inspired and motivate many researchers and economists to find an alternative benchmark in line with the economic standards to replace the existing LIBOR interest rate. So the goal of this research, therefore, is to introduce an alternative Islamic benchmark that achieve both economic and the Sharia objectives. So what is the problem with the LIBOR? LIBOR was originally survey-based benchmark, complied by panels of banks, answering the question at what rate could you borrow fund, were you to do so, by asking for and then accepting the interbank over in a reasonable market size, just a period to 11 a.m. In the wake of the manipulation scandal, regulators found that there were very few transactions taking place to support some of the currencies and tenor for which LIBOR was published. As such, LIBOR submissions were largely based upon experts' judgment rather than real transaction data. And this led concern that LIBOR was unrepresentative and vulnerable to potential manipulation, which in turn culminated in a number of criminal actions brought in various jurisdictions around the world. So the benchmark reform or the timeline, there is many models or alternative models have been submitted to replace the LIBOR. This slide here refers to the timeline of the benchmark reform. Pre-2012, widespread allegation of London interbank over rate manipulation. In September 2012, UK Weekly Review recommends reform rather than replacement of LIBOR. In February 2014, ICE Benchmark Administration Ltd take over LIBOR administration, and then in July 2014, Financial Stability Board (FSB) recommends migration to risk-free rate. In July 2017, Andrew Bailey, Chief Executive of UK Financial Conduct Authority, announced that the FCA will no longer compel banks to submit the LIBOR after the end of 2021. June to December 2017, Euro overnight index average and LIBOR designed critical. In January 2018, PMR enter into forest robust fallback plan required for EU supervised entity that are benchmark users. In September 2018, ISD published benchmark supplement. In April 2018, Bank of England assumed administrations of reform sterling overnight index average. Also, during the same period, New York Federal Reserve published secured overnight financing rate. In July 2019, European Money Market Institute authorized with Belgian regulators to publish a reform European interbank overnight rate. In October 2019, European central banks to launch Esther. In the first January 2020 BMR deadline for EU index providers to be authorized or qualify for an exemption. So ONIA to discontinue to comply with BMR on 31st December 2019. So here, what are the risk-free rate and how are risk-free rate different from LIBOR? Risk-free rate are a benchmark generally based on overnight deposit rate and are also known as the alternative reference rate. And they are considered to be more robust as they are based upon large volume of observable transaction. And risk-free rate has identified for each currency for which LIBOR is currently published. So how are risk-free rates different from LIBORs? There is such differences between both of them because each index has or each index has its own risk profile. For example, here all currently available risk-free rate are backward looking term, while the LIBOR is forward looking term. And they don't build all the risk-free rate not built in the same kind of premium for term or bank credit risk, while the LIBOR included. And also all risk-free rates are administered locally and therefore are published at a different time, while the LIBOR is internationally and also published in specific time, which usually is before 11 a.m. Here the approaches to benchmark reform. Each country has, many countries has submitted and has created their own benchmark, and all of those benchmark is established based on the based on the risk-free rate, which is overnight treasury repo. Like for example, in US and in such country, they use overnight and secure deposit, and in the others, they use the overnight treasury repo. Like for example, you have USA, UK, Eurozone area, and Switzerland, Japan, Australia, Canada, Singapore, and Hong Kong. So now we are going to discuss how the impact of LIBOR reform on Islamic finance. So there is four main issues that is going to affect the Islamic financial industry. The first one is fallback, where an Islamic banking facilities references LIBOR and the term of that facility extend beyond the end of 2020. Then the transaction parties will need to consider if any fallback provisions. Second issue is related to practical issue related to using risk-free rate. LIBOR is forward-looking term, where the proposed replacement risk-free rate are backward-looking daily overnight rate. And the timing and the basis of calculation of interest and profit rate under finance documentations will therefore need to be amended and adjusted, where risk-free rate are used instead of LIBOR. Also, the use of non-term LIBOR the use of non-term risk-free rate may also create issue in terms of budgeting and banks' operational system. Also, the third issue which related to value transfer and spread adjustment. Risk-free rate are typically based on overnight deposit rate of the relevant central bank and do not include the term liquidity premium and bank credit risk inherent in LIBOR. Simply replacing the LIBOR with the risk-free rate without any spread adjustment will reduce the overall financing cost and reduce the economic value of financing arrangement to the bank. The third issue which refer to the structural issue for Islamic banking facilities. And then here, Islamic banking facilities will have specific additional challenging in adopting to the use of backward looking risk-free rate. And due to that fact, such facilities typically using cash flow received from an asset or provisions of service to generate return on the financing that must, under Sharia compliance, be determined at the time the asset-based transaction is taking place or the provision of service is agreed. Because usually in Islamic finance, most of the contract or the price of the contract is determined at the beginning of the period. So, and if we are using risk-free rate, usually the cost of financing is appear at the end of or at the maturity date. So this will lead to will lead to the GIRAR. So this is our model. Here we propose the model for an Islamic benchmark, whereas in Islamic jurisprudence, market price is a common term widely used in determining the fair price in many settlements, especially as a mean for settlement to resolve dispute either through arbitration or through the court. And there are many hadiths in which the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam refused to set price and leave it to be decided by the market. And based on those hadiths, we in this study we propose that Islamic benchmark for financing, evaluating or pricing in financial industry can be established through the application of general equilibrium theory, as this theory defines that equilibrium in the financial market is the state in which fund supply is completely equal to the fund demand. And as a result of the absence of the shortage of or supply market, price remains stable during this situation. So the establishment of this model is based on several assumptions. The first assumption is that the financing unit traded in the equilibrium market is homogeneous and the equilibrium market is complete and efficient, in which all investors, depositors, and financiers have the sufficient information about the market. Third is equilibrium market contain many investors and they are competing honestly. Investors' investment decision in equilibrium market are completely independent from the financial decision. The equilibrium market is completely independent from other types of markets. So then here in this figure, we show the equilibrium interest rate, or we call it Islamic economic rate, which refer to the opportunity cost. So general equilibrium theory aims to explain the behavior of supply, demand, and price in financial market by attempting to show that interaction of supply and demand for funds can lead to generally can lead to general and comprehensive equilibrium in the price level in the financial market. And the study at hand assumed that the economic growth rate index refer to the equilibrium state of equilibrium interest rate, which represent the right opportunity cost for the financial transaction parties, and therefore it can be applied in computing the Islamic rate of return instead of using risk-free rate that is debt-based. So in this figure, you can see here, this is the fund supply, and here we have fund demand, and then the interaction between the fund and supply and demand will lead to the equilibrium market equilibrium price, which can measure through the economic growth rate. Here we have saving and investment funds, saving and investment activities in the industry, and then here the price of the funds supply and demand will be determined through the Islamic rate of return. So measurement also, we need to measure the interaction between the daily fluctuation of the demand and supply between the fund supply and demand. So to do so, then here taking into account the relationship between supply and demand is essential in calculating the Islamic rate of return. And this is due to the fact that change in the fund supply or demand will lead to change the price level of the requested fund in the financial market. And this research, therefore, apply the coefficient of determination to measure the size of the relationship between the fund supply and demand in Islamic fund financial market using the following formula. So this is the formula to measure the interaction or to measure the beta risk actually in of the fund in the financial market. So where R square measure the overall effect of demand on supply, and here actually R square will equal to the estimated coefficient, because when you have only two variables, usually the R equal the estimated coefficient of the effect of the demand on the supply. That's why we use the R square, because also in just R square, we can include all the financial institution that be included in the model, like how many banks you have in your country. Then you have to log how many, you have to take the data or the information from the banks. Usually the central bank has all this information about from the local bank. Then you can calculate the effect of the demand on the supply. Then after that, also we have to consider the price elements in the model, because when the bankers or the financial institution lend their money to the borrowers, they are going to take such risk. Then in this case, we have also to include the market risk, either the credit risk or liquidity risk, and so on. So then the risk premium can measure through the market risk minus the economic growth rate. So this is the formula to calculate the IRR, Islamic rate of return, equal economic growth rate plus the risk premium times the interaction between the fund demand and supply. Also here, this is the economic growth rate, which refer to the opportunity cost, because from Islamic point of view, we have to redefine the opportunity cost. In conventional market, they use the risk-free rate, which is debt-based. However, in Islamic finance or in Islamic economic, we cannot use the debt as, or the debt instrument as the measurement of the opportunity cost. Okay. So conclusion here, recommendations. The study used general equilibrium theory with assessed price model to establish the Islamic benchmark IRR, and then the economic growth rate represent the equilibrium rate, equilibrium price or interest rate between the fund supply and demand in the financial market, which refer to the opportunity cost. And the new model take into account the market risk premium and daily fluctuations and change in the level of supply and demand funds. So recommendation here, the proposed model of Islamic rate of return must be examined to avoid any economic and financial negative implications that may occur in the future. Islamic rate of return using the economic growth rate is Islamic rate of return using economic growth rate instead of risk-free rate to evaluate the opportunity cost, since the risk-free rate is debt-based, while the Islamic rate of return is real economic based, in which the opportunity cost is measured through the economic growth rate of the country. Sorry. Also, when calculating the Islamic rate of return benchmark, local and international economic growth rate must be taken into consideration. For example, when local financing contracts are made, the local economic growth rate must be applied. And when international financial contracts are made, the international economic growth rate must be applied. And this therefore prevent any chance for speculative business and unlawful profit. Islamic financial institutions should establish also financial allocations to meet the fluctuation in the price level of contract and financial assets resulting from the applied of new interest rate after 2020, whether risk-free rate or IRR. In this table here, we compare the three interest rate, the LIBOR as well as the risk-free rate and the Islamic rate of return. In terms of the opportunity cost measurement, the LIBOR they use risk-free rate, and the alternative reference rate also they are using risk-free rate. In Islamic rate of return, we are using the economic growth rate. In terms of opportunity cost, the LIBOR using the risk-free rate, which is debt-based. Same also with risk-free rate. They are debt-based, while Islamic opportunity cost is economic based. So in terms of credit premium or element of pricing, LIBOR there is a credit premium is included. In risk-free rate or the alternative reference rate, there is no credit premium. In Islamic rate of return, we have included the credit premium. In terms of the value of the time value framework, LIBOR and risk-free rate, they are based on the time value of money, while the Islamic rate of return it is based on the time value of economic resource, which is in line with the Sharia principles. So calculation methodology here in LIBOR we use a survey based. In alternative reference rate they use risk-free rate equal 1 plus the government bond rate divided by 1 plus inflation rate minus 1. In Islamic rate of return, as we have discussed earlier, Islamic rate of return equal the economic growth rate plus the risk premium times the interaction between demand, fund demand and supply. So in terms of financing cost, LIBOR is high, risk-free rate is very low. And for the Islamic is fair because it reflect what is reflect the growth rate of the economy. Price decision, in terms of price decision, LIBOR is monopoly. Only 16 members of the panel banks to decide the price. But for the risk-free rate, it is free to each central bank. Similar also with Islamic rate of return, which will be free to each central bank. Sharia compliant, the risk-free rate and the LIBOR are not Sharia compliant because they are on debt base and the time value of money. While the Islamic rate of return is the Sharia compliant because it is economic based and it is based on the time value of economic resource. And the time structure here, in terms of time structure, the term structure with LIBOR is 7 different forward-looking tenor from overnight to 12 months. For the risk-free rate is a backward-looking overnight rate only. For the Islamic forward-looking tenor from overnight to 12 months, because you can calculate is daily and then you can calculate the effective interest rate to have the yearly real rate. Then you can decide the price of your contract at the beginning. So financing cost due date, LIBOR at the beginning. However, the alternative reference rate usually at the maturity date, which lead to ghirar, and also for Islamic is at the beginning of the transaction. So in terms of administrator, the LIBOR is regulated by the FCA and administrated by ICE benchmark administrations. For the risk-free rate is administrated by local central bank, similar also with the Islamic rate of return. For the currency used, for LIBOR only 5 currency. For risk-free rate and Islamic rate of return, you can use your own local currency. So for issue, LIBOR is international. For the risk-free rate is local. However, for Islamic rate of return, it will be both local and international. When we use local, we have to use the economic growth rate of the country. When we use international, we have international transaction. We have to refer to the international economic growth rate. In terms of transparency, LIBOR is exposure to manipulations, as what happened with the LIBOR. And for risk-free rate is transparent to such degree, but for the Islamic rate of return will be fully transparent because the calculation of the calculation of the Islamic rate of return will be based on the economic growth rate. Thank you. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi ta'ala wa barakatuh.